Good evening. Welcome to the Spring 2024 Craig Talks. We have some exciting presentations for you this evening. They'll inform and hopefully entertain you, perhaps give you some new perspectives for your business or your career. We hold Craig Talks because we believe that the business school and the business community form a natural, mutually beneficial relationship and partnership. We have a lot to learn from each other. And the more we come together, the more enriching our conversations will be. So at Craig Talks, we present our faculty research as a conversation starter. Our goal is to spark new ideas from you that you can put into practice in your business and that you can also share with us. So we are recording the presentations, and the presentations will go from beginning to end. Questions, we look forward to your questions afterward while we are able to enjoy some more drinks and more food. So please continue the conversation after the presentations are complete. So tonight, our theme is connections. You'll hear stories about how technology connections bring us closer, but sometimes uncomfortably so, in the case of workplace surveillance. You'll also hear about a new infrastructure project that will make physical connections, such as shipping goods, more seamless, strengthening the Central Valley's bonds with trading partners. And you'll hear about family connections and how they can be integral to business success. So I would like to, in advance, thank all of our speakers tonight, including Dr. Zhanna Sahatjian, Dr. Fernando Parra of the Craig School of Business, Dr. Ali Tawfiq of the Lyles College of Engineering, and Ms. Simran Judy of the Fresno Council of Governments. All of our staff who have worked so hard on creating tonight's event, our fearless editor, Barbara Morgan, who looks so relieved and happy right now. We really appreciate all that you have done to make this a reality and all of you being here tonight. It means a lot to us to have you here connecting with one another. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to our business associates who support Craig Talks and the accompanying magazine, which you already have a copy of, the Central California Business Review. I am very proud to introduce our featured faculty research presenter, who is a distinguished researcher and a valued member of our Craig faculty. She has published in her short career to date 35 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. She has over 30 presentations at national peer-reviewed conferences and international conferences. And she is an academic leader in research on ethics in organizations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zhanna Sahatjian.
Well, thank you, Julie, for that lovely introduction. And good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Zhanna Sahatjian, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Management in the Craig School of Business. I've been here, this is my 10th year coming to an end here. The time has gone by very quickly, and I'm really excited and happy to be here. So I figured I'd start by telling you all just a little bit about how I ended up in this space. About 15 years ago, when I first entered the University of Oklahoma as a new PhD student, one of the things that all PhD students had to do was work on a research grant or for funding, or be a TA, a teaching assistant. And I was automatically placed on a research grant that was just funded from the National Science Foundation, and it was a research ethics grant. And so I was placed on it, and one of the first things that the leading researcher, Dr. Michael Mumford, and his colleague, Dr. Shane Connolly, who happened to be my dissertation advisor, the first thing they said is, you're going to have to read a bunch of articles that are in this space to kind of get familiar with the area. So they threw a lot of articles at me, and I started sifting through it. I spent many nights reading. My background is in psychology, so I thought, well, this is a really good space for me. Let me see what I can do with this. And it was, I say that I fell into this particular area because I was placed on it, and it was just the right fit from the start. I immediately was captivated by how people make ethical decisions, how seemingly trustworthy, honest people could do some untrustworthy and dishonest things. And I read multiple articles about something about the person, so characteristics about people that lead them to make unethical decisions. And then also, something that was really intriguing for me was the environmental factors. Like, what is it about the situation that leads people to make some interesting choices in life? And so I read and I read and I read some more, and I read things about, well, is it men or women who makes more ethical choices? It's women. If you were wondering, it's women. It's consistently women for decades and decades of research that's been done in this area. Women make more ethical decisions. Women have more ethical intents. And with respect to men, they are more likely to undermine their competitors and to make some unethical choices. And then I read research about age and, is it older individuals, younger individuals, and consistently research, a bit mixed there, but consistently people under 30, less likely to make ethical decisions, people over 30, more likely to make ethical decisions. I then started reading about the situational aspects and things like, companies that have a code of conduct in place, or companies that offer ethics training consistently and refresher ethics training consistently. Are those companies, do they tend to have better ethical culture? And sure enough. So there was some interesting research from psychology and sociology about lighting. Dimly lit spaces, people are more likely to make unethical decisions in dimly lit spaces, and spaces that are more cluttered than cleaner spaces. So it was so interesting that I jumped in head first, and 15 years later, I'm still doing research on ethics. And so it's keeping with this theme of situational and environmental aspects that lead to potentially unethical behavior. I am in this new area for me, well, since about 2019, where my colleagues and I were sitting around and talking about, technology in the workplace is so pervasive now, and employee monitoring is getting more and more sophisticated. And yet there's so much negative response from employees that are subjected to employee monitoring on a daily basis. So we thought to ourselves, we were curious. What is it about being monitored that makes people so uncomfortable? And that's kind of what I want to talk to you all about. So we did, this effort is more of a two-part study. We did we dove into the literature, and we did a comprehensive review, and we looked at that, and then we did an experimental study. So first things first, what is employee monitoring? And I think everybody's familiar with it, but it's the idea of your performance as an employee being monitored by usually technological means, could be without technological assistance if somebody is just plain watching you the entire time. But in terms of what is actually happening here, well, so more recently, we're seeing desktop monitoring, and that's kind of been around. We are seeing keystroke tracking on the computer, video surveillance, and I think that one is the one that most people are familiar with, having cameras installed in various spaces in the organization. And then really some of the more recent work is on biometrics and brain activity monitoring. In fact, just about a week ago or two, the Wall Street Journal published a really interesting article about employees' brain waves being monitored through an app. And the company purports that the reason they're doing it is to ensure that the employees are not anxious or stressed throughout the day, because that can affect your productivity. So the company says, well, you know what, we're monitoring your brain activity because we want to make sure that you're healthy and you're not stressed and you're not anxious the whole time, because we want you to be at your top, right? So really interesting. And when I say it's getting really sophisticated and quite pervasive, I think this is up there. And then you've got GPS tracking, location tracking, and that one I think a lot of people are familiar with. You've got Amazon that's doing that via apps for their drivers. They're essentially tracking how their drivers are, whether they're driving safely throughout the day, where they're going, what routes they're taking, how many stops they're making. And again, the companies say, well, it's because we want to make sure that our drivers are being safe, right? So there is a very positive outlook on this, at least from the employer's perspective. Okay, so what exactly is being monitored? If you were wondering, so first of all, over 80% of major global companies are using some sort of surveillance. Some sort of employee monitoring systems are in place. But in case you were wondering what exactly is being monitored, there is a recent study that asked employers to weigh in on what they're actually doing. And you've got about 66% saying, hey, we're watching what our employees, in terms of what websites are being visited by our employees. 53% said the time being spent and the apps being used are of interest, so they're logging that information. Capturing screens, so that one is a common one. In the magazine, if you take the time to read the article, I mentioned in there a company out of Florida that actually asks their employees to take a screenshot every 10 minutes while they're working, to essentially, to see like exactly what they're watching. And that could be frustrating probably and really disruptive to your workday, but every 10 minutes they're having to screen capture. Active work hours, logging in times, chats and messaging, and then monitoring your computer files and transcribing calls and watching your inbound and outbound emails. So that's what they're actually monitoring, surveilling. And then when I say that it's getting really pervasive, I have here for you a graph from a recent article that tracked basically the demand for employee monitoring compared to 2019. So if you think back to that time, this was right before COVID, and but if you look at this, notice, okay, so January 2020, terrible time, right before the terrible time in all our lives in March when everything shut down. But if you look at this, I mean, we got a huge hike. All of a sudden, employers everywhere are looking. The demand is increasing. Searches on Amazon for surveillance tools and technologies is up. Demand is like up. You see a bit of a decrease. This is right about as COVID was dispersing a little bit. And then you've got, but then again, once you get to 2023, it becomes a little more consistent. And so there is, we sort of see a little up and down and fluctuations across, but then we see kind of this, like, this is where it's hovering. So the demand is still there, right? So we've got a lot of people wanting this technology, and we've got employers watching various things, as I showed you on the previous slide. But why specifically are they surveilling their employees? And so when we looked at the literature, it was really interesting because employers said, well, we're watching our employees because we can't, some say, well, we can't watch them firsthand anymore because they're remote, right? So that became a big reason during the time of COVID. So they said, we need the technology because we have to monitor performance somehow, and this is really the only way. Lots of other reasons. I mean, there's the misconduct and theft. Employers were complaining of, office supplies and things disappearing. So that became a big reason for it. And then there's literature out there that shows that there is a useful side of employee monitoring and that it can prevent accidents, right? There is that. When people do know that you've got cameras watching, they are a bit more, they do tend to watch what they're doing a lot more. So there's accident, and they tend to carry out their assigned tasks more often than not. So there are reasons, I mean, some really, I think, from the employer side, some really strong reasons for why they're surveilling their employees. But now, if you shift to the employee side, the employees are not happy. In fact, when we reviewed the literature, it was like, no, this is terrible. It's an invasion of our privacy. The invasion of privacy becomes the biggest reason. Some employees cite dehumanization. They say, well, you know what, this breaks our trust with our leader and our boss. There's lots of studies out there on decreased job satisfaction for employees that are being watched. And then more recently, some ways to circumvent the monitoring. So one is, funny example, is a mouse that went pretty viral during the time of COVID that essentially jiggles on its own to show, and you can find it on Amazon, it's pretty cheap. I looked, but it jiggles, every few minutes to say, hey, I'm still here, I'm still working, right? And so there's ways now that employees are actually looking to circumvent the monitoring and to get back at employers in a different way. So lots of people getting creative. Okay, so which brings me to our work, and I'll just do a quick overview because I know you have the article, but we did two things. We first reviewed the literature because, and it was myself and two other co-authors, Dr. Chase Steele and Dr. Alexander McDougall, from different states, different institutions. And what we did, we all just dove in and we read and we read and we read some more. And we then came together via Zoom just a number of times. One is in Wyoming, one is in Michigan, and then myself in California, so we had to use Zoom. But we came together multiple times and we discussed the literature and we looked for common themes. And what we found was really, honestly, it was a strong, employees don't hate the monitoring. They hate the way it's being administered. And that was the overall finding of just reading all the studies. And these are studies from engineering and psychology and sociology and business. It wasn't about the tools. No one really had anything about the tools. It was the way those tools were being administered that was causing concern and discontent for employees. So we took that and we talked about it and we said, well, you know what's interesting is that there is a lot of research on this, but very little conversation among scholars and researchers and people in this field about, well, how do we administer the monitoring systems better? If they're here to stay, which was obvious to us back in 2019 when we were having these discussions, it was already on the rise. But we had a hunch that it's going to get more sophisticated. It's going to get more interesting. The demand is going up. So there's got to be a more fair and ethical way to administer these systems that don't bring about so much negativity. So that's what we did. What we did is we turned to, as psychologists, we turned to some psychological theories, and we turned to specifically a theory on ethical leadership, which is one that is one of the more known theories on leadership, but specifically one that says, hey, ethical leaders are moral people and they're moral managers. This goes back to research back to 2004, 2005, 2006 with Linda Trevino and Mike Brown, who did a lot of work. They interviewed a ton of people, executives. They interviewed ethics officers to see what makes an ethical leader. And then numerous studies followed. But basically, these are leaders or bosses who have certain traits. Honesty, trustworthiness tend to be the top ones, who show certain behaviors, like they show concern, they're fair, they're open, they listen, but then also they're moral managers too, in that they don't just talk the talk, but they walk the talk as well. And these are leaders that they'll use rewards and discipline, but they'll do it to promote ethical behavior in their organization, to promote ethical culture. They're big on role modeling, ethical behavior. So again, when I say they walk the talk, you know, they really embrace their message, and they communicate that ethical message constantly to their employees. So we took that theory, and what we did with it is we turned the main tenets of that theory into principles for ethical administration of employee monitoring systems. And we got out of it 9 specific principles, recommendations that we made to managers. We published that study, and you can read more about these and really view these. I'll just bring your attention to a couple. If you look at like the first one, encouraging employee voice, this is one of the main tenets that ethical leaders really stand by, is meaning that you encourage your employees to actually speak up and give their opinions on the systems that are in place, to speak up when it comes to the design and development of, so that bring them in and let them weigh in on how the system is being implemented, what systems are being implemented, where you're being watched. So that's in one example. Limiting monitoring to relevant context. If there are places in your organization where theft tends to happen more often than not, limit it to those areas. You really shouldn't be monitoring, like employee lounges, and especially monitoring should not be occurring on off time for employees. Other recommendations are here, but I know I'm running low on time. I got 2 minutes, so I'm going to tell you one more thing. So then we published that study. We took that information and we ran an experimental study because we were curious how it affects. When employee monitoring is in place, how does it affect trust between the employee and the leader? And so we ran that study. We had 96 pairs of employee and employee supervisor pairs. And you can see here, so 33, 34-ish years old was the average age for employees, and 44-ish years old for average age for leaders. We had them, the employees rated their bosses on ethical leadership, and then the bosses actually indicated the frequency with which they monitor their employees. And so we had a couple of questions like, how often to what extent do you use cameras or other technologies for surveillance, and how often is it running, that kind of thing. And I put this here, and all I'm going to say, I didn't know how much quantitative data to include, but all I'll tell you is this: we found a really interesting interaction. And if you look at this, so this solid line are low monitoring. So employees that were under low monitoring, the ones that had ethical leaders, their trust was higher and stronger for employees that were under low monitoring systems and lower for employees that were under high monitoring systems, which essentially says, and this is my final takeaway, is that employee monitoring, what we found, and there's more statistics and more data. If you ever want to see the article, I'm happy to share. But what we found is that the monitoring that's in place erodes the trust relationship between the leader and the employee, specifically when you've got an ethical leader in place. So what you've got already is a really strong leader who encompasses that ethical message. And then you take in and you bring in monitoring, and it basically nullifies what this person is trying to do, right? And so our big takeaway there was, if you're a manager, if you're a practitioner, and you're considering that, if you're already pouring money into hiring good people, say you're using some selection systems for ethics, and so if you're already pouring money into hiring people that encompass what you're looking for in terms of ethics, and then you bring in a monitoring system, what you're doing then is negating what you just put in place. So ultimately, put in one or the other, not both. They're not complementary. Many people think, let's just do it all, right? We'll get a really good person, we'll get some cameras, it'll just annihilate all unethical behavior. But that's not the case. In fact, what it does is it ruins the relationship between the good people you hired, and now they're stuck having to work harder because they're explaining all the time why you need that when they're already here. So one of the reviewers on that study said, well, what about the leader that's coming in and they have no choice, right? It's already there. And that could happen. The system is already in place, and you just came in, and that could happen. That is when those recommendations, those principles, those become even more important. That's when you come in and you encourage employees to weigh in, you review the design, you look for ways that you can ensure that your employees are feeling comfortable and that they're working in a fair environment. I had a brief video, but I don't think we have the time for it. My co-author was actually on the Today Show talking about our work, and I do have the video, but I don't believe we have the time. I don't know. Do it? Okay. It's very short, but this is Dr. Chase Steele, who's my co-author. He's out of the University of Wyoming.
For many Americans, working from home is now more feasible than ever. One recent survey showing 58% of respondents say they can work remotely at least one day a week, with 35% having the option to work from home the entire week. And with more people operating outside of the office, some companies are stepping up worker tracking, or so-called tattleware or surveillance software. That is, supervisors monitoring daily activities through company-issued devices, including keyboard usage, screen time, clicks, and more.
I would definitely leave that company and try to seek a job elsewhere.
If it was a company I really admired and worked for, I wouldn't be bothered by it.
A recent New York Times investigation found 8 of the 10 largest private employers in the U.S. track the productivity metrics of their workers, many of them in real time, leading to many employees being subject to scores, trackers, idle buttons, and more, which can lead to lost wages and in some cases even terminations, according to the Times. Earlier this year, we chatted with business ethics professor J.S. Nelson, who told us people working somewhere with more than 500 employees should be on high alert.
Definitely need to think about being photographed, listening through your microphone, keystroke logging software. So recording what you're typing at any given time, what websites you're going to, who you're communicating with.
As increased productivity and transparency have been cited as benefits of everyday worker tracking, experts say workers being treated fairly is crucial.
When an employee doesn't feel the ability to control what's happening, how does it affect their behavior at work? They feel less responsibility to do good work, to be the best employee they can be, to fully engage themselves. And monitoring strips that away. It takes them away from their work in that sense because they're not as engaged in it.
And with more and more employees already feeling burnt out, some workers argue not every job or task can be monitored digitally, often leading to real work falling outside of tracking data, including face-to-face meetings.
You simply can't track all the behaviors that go into a successful workday. You have to continue to focus on employees' work output, not necessarily the inputs.
And while there are creative options out there that might be able to help,
if you work from home, you need a mouse jiggler. It jiggles your mouse to make it seem like you're working.
some are weighing whether to keep their jobs or take their talents elsewhere.
Wait, there's a mouse jiggler?
They think you're working.
Oh, so
exactly.
Okay, that's next level.
Keep it moving. Yeah. So then are the companies obligated to tell their workers that they're monitoring them?
This is a gray area. It sort of depends on where you live, Chanel, but legal experts, ethics experts have long said, look, if you're an employer and you're using this, the best practice is be upfront about it. Tell your employees what the expectations are. And if you're a worker, have that conversation. Talk to your boss, talk to your HR department, ask how the data is being collected, how is it being used. At the end of the day, if everybody's doing the right thing, we're good. But this stuff is here to stay.
Yeah, and those are computers probably that are owned by the company that you're using.
Yes, they can put it on your personal devices, but so many of us take home our work tablet and laptop and phone. So expect it, especially if your company is 500 people or over.
Okay.
I think you're right. Just expect it.
Okay. Expect it, but I think it is the right thing to do for companies to be like, just FYI, we can monitor you.
Yeah, right. Letting you know.
And it's the right thing to do for employees to do.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you, Vic.
I have my email here. I'm happy to send any of the papers or answer additional questions. And at this time, I would love to introduce, bring up our next speaker and let them take over.